The following is independent geopolitical analysis and personal opinion only. Nothing in this video constitutes news reporting, and all conclusions drawn here are based on publicly available information and represent my personal interpretation of events. Please consult multiple sources before forming your own views. Something just shifted in the architecture of this war, and almost nobody is talking about what it actually means. Not the headlines, not the pundits, not even most of the think tanks that get paid to watch this stuff full time. What the United States just did, quietly, methodically, and in a way that most casual observers completely missed, may have fundamentally altered the trajectory of the conflict in Ukraine. And here is the part that genuinely surprised me when I started pulling this analysis together. Even Kyiv did not fully see this coming, so let us slow down, take a breath, and actually think through what is happening here. In my analysis, we are living through one of the most consequential periods in post-Cold War geopolitical history, and the noise surrounding it is so loud that the signal keeps getting buried. Every day there is a new headline, a new statement from a general or a foreign minister, a new set of satellite images or battlefield maps being passed around on social media, and all of that creates a kind of fog, not the fog of war exactly, but the fog of information overload. What I want to do today is cut through that fog and offer you a clear, calm, honest reading of what I believe is actually happening and why it matters far beyond the borders of Ukraine and Russia. Before we go any further, let me give you the essential background, because I know not everyone watching this has been following every twist and turn of this conflict since it escalated in February of 2022. Russia launched what it described as a special military operation into Ukraine. The stated goals shifted multiple times. The early push toward Kyiv failed. Russia consolidated in the east and south. Ukraine launched counteroffensives, some of which succeeded, some of which stalled. Western nations, led prominently by the United States, provided Ukraine with financial aid, weapons systems, intelligence support, and diplomatic backing. Sanctions were imposed. On Russia in waves, Russia adapted, found alternative trading partners, restructured its economy around wartime production, and dug in. That is the compressed version of roughly 3 years of extraordinarily complex events. What matters for today's analysis is where things stand right now and what just changed. Drawing on my reading of open-source reporting and policy analysis, including work from major Western outlets and independent research institutions whose coverage I will link in the description below, it is my assessment that the United States has been engaged in a quiet but significant strategic repositioning over the past several months. It is not a single dramatic announcement. It is not one weapons package or one phone call. It is a convergence of several simultaneous moves that, when you map them together, tell a coherent and rather startling story. And that story, in my reading, is this: Washington has decided, at a level that goes well beyond public messaging, that the conditions for ending this war need to be engineered from the outside, not simply waited for. And the method they have chosen to do this is one that most people, including many in Kyiv's own government, did not anticipate. Let me walk you through my 3 points of analysis, because I think each one is essential to understanding the full picture. The first point is what actually happened, not the surface version, but the structural reality underneath it. In my analysis, what we are witnessing is the United States moving from a posture of sustained support to one of active conflict architecture. That is a subtle but enormously important distinction. Sustained support means you keep giving a partner the tools to fight and you let the battlefield determine the outcome. Active conflict architecture means you start shaping the conditions under which a negotiated or forced endpoint becomes possible. You stop being a supplier and start being a strategic director. What does that look like in practice? Based on publicly available reports and the analytical work of researchers who track these things far more granularly than any single commentator can, there are several things happening at once. First, in my analysis, and based on patterns observable in open-source diplomatic reporting, it appears that the United States may have been engaging in back-channel conversations through intermediaries at a level of seriousness that analysts suggest is qualitatively different from what we have seen in earlier phases of this conflict. I want to be clear that this is my interpretive reading, not a confirmed report. Analysts at several European think tanks, including institutions in Berlin and Paris that have maintained communication channels throughout this conflict, have noted a shift in the tone and the substance of these conversations. This is not about appeasement. It is about architecture. Washington appears to be sketching the outlines of what an endgame could look like without publicly committing to any specific framework. Second, and this is the part that I find most analytically significant, the United States has made several quiet but concrete decisions about the ceiling of its military support. Not a withdrawal of support, but a definition of its limits. In my analysis, this is something fundamentally different from what has been communicated publicly. The public message has consistently been some version of "we will support Ukraine for as long as it takes." But what we are seeing in the actual behavior of the administration, based on reporting from multiple credible outlets, suggests that there is now a much more active internal conversation about what the realistic endpoint of this conflict looks like and what the United States is willing to do and not do to reach it. Third, there is the dimension of economic pressure. Analysts suggest that Washington has been coordinating, with far greater precision than has been publicly acknowledged, an intensification of the enforcement of existing sanctions in ways specifically designed to degrade Russia's capacity to sustain its current level of military operations. Over a multi-year timeline, this is not new sanctions. This is the aggressive closing of the loopholes that have allowed Russia to effectively work around the existing sanctions architecture. When you look at the publicly available data on Russia's secondary market access to semiconductors and dual-use technologies, you start to see something interesting. The flow has not stopped, but it has slowed in ways that have real consequences for production timelines, and in a war of attrition, production timelines matter enormously. Now here is what I think is really happening underneath all of this. In my personal analytical reading, and I want to emphasize this is opinion, not reporting, it appears that Washington may have reached an internal assessment that a traditional military victory for Ukraine, in the conventional sense of that term, is not the most likely outcome of this conflict. This is my interpretation. Others will read the evidence differently, and I encourage you to seek out those alternative views. What we are looking at is a situation where both sides are caught in a kind of equilibrium of exhaustion, but where the United States believes it now has both the leverage and the strategic clarity to begin nudging that equilibrium toward resolution. The mechanism for doing this is not a single dramatic move. It is a combination of sustained pressure on Russia's economic lifelines, a carefully calibrated restraint in the weapons it provides to Ukraine, a set of back-channel conversations that most people are not aware of, and a quiet but unmistakable signaling to Kyiv that the window of maximum Western support is not infinite. That is point one. What actually happened, not a dramatic announcement, but a fundamental strategic repositioning that most analysts are missing because they are looking at the surface rather than the structure. Point two is why this matters more than people think, and this is where I want to really slow down and ask you to stay with me, because this is the part of the analysis that I think is genuinely underappreciated. Most of the commentary about this conflict operates within a fairly simple frame. There is an aggressor and a victim. There is a right side and a wrong side. Western democracies are supporting the right side. The question is just one of resources and resolve. And look, I understand why that frame exists. There is real truth in it. Russia did invade Ukraine. Ukrainians are fighting for their sovereignty and their survival. Those are real and important things. But in my analysis, that frame, while morally legitimate, is analytically insufficient. It does not give you the tools to understand what is actually happening at the strategic level, and it does not help you predict where things are going. Here is what most people are missing. The United States is not simply a generous patron writing checks and shipping weapons out of the goodness of its democratic heart. It is a great power with its own strategic interests, its own resource constraints, and its own reading of where this conflict is heading. And right now, based on everything that is publicly available and everything that experienced analysts are saying, Washington's reading is changing, not in its fundamental sympathies, but in its strategic calculus. Why does this matter more than people think? Because the shift in Washington's posture has enormous downstream consequences that most people have not begun to trace. Let me give you 3 specific examples. The first consequence is about Ukraine's negotiating position. Here is something that is genuinely uncomfortable to say, but I think it is analytically necessary. If the United States is beginning to define the ceiling of its support more clearly, and if it is engaging in back-channel conversations about an endgame framework, then Ukraine's negotiating position is actually becoming more complex, not simpler. On one level, this could look like pressure on Kyiv to consider terms it has previously rejected. On another level, it could actually be a sophisticated strategy to give Ukraine the strongest possible hand before those conversations become more formal. The ambiguity here is real, and I want to be honest with you about it. In my analysis, both of these things could be true simultaneously. Washington could be genuinely working to strengthen Ukraine's position while also, quietly and carefully, beginning to shape the conditions for an eventual diplomatic process. The second consequence is about European security architecture. Here is something most analysts are missing. The way this conflict ends, and the process by which it ends, will have enormous implications for the future of European security for decades. if the United States is moving toward a more active role in shaping the endpoint. That changes the role of European powers in the process. Germany, France, the United Kingdom, Poland, and the Baltic states all have different and sometimes conflicting interests when it comes to what a settlement might look like. Some want a clear Ukrainian military victory. Others are privately more focused on stability and the economic costs of prolonged conflict. Washington's shift, if it is as significant as I believe it is, forces all of these actors to recalibrate, and that recalibration is already happening, based on the diplomatic signaling we can observe in publicly available reporting. The third consequence is about the precedent this sets for the global rules-based order. This is the big picture, the 30,000-foot view, and I think it is the most important consequence of all. How this conflict ends sends a signal to every other potential aggressor and every other potential target in the international system. If Russia ends this conflict having achieved even a portion of its territorial objectives, even through a negotiated settlement, that sends one kind of signal. If Ukraine ends this conflict with its sovereignty meaningfully restored and its security guaranteed, that sends a very different signal. The United States knows this. The question, in my analysis, is whether Washington believes it can engineer an endpoint that sends the right signal without paying a price that the American political system is unwilling to pay. And that is a genuinely difficult question, one for which I do not think anyone has a clean answer right now. So why does the shift in Washington's posture matter more than people think? Because it is not just about Ukraine and Russia. It is about the entire architecture of how great powers manage conflicts in a multipolar world. It is about whether diplomatic engineering can substitute for military victory. And it is about whether the United States still has the strategic capacity to shape outcomes in a conflict of this complexity and duration. Those are enormous questions, and the moves Washington is making right now are the early answers. Point 3 is what happens next, and this is where I will be explicit that I am offering you my prediction, based on my reading of the available evidence and my understanding of how these dynamics tend to play out historically. I could be wrong. I want to be clear about that. Geopolitics is not a predictive science, it is an analytical art. But here is my best reading of where this goes. In my analysis, we are moving toward a period of what I would call structured ambiguity. This is a phase where the United States and its allies quietly work to create the conditions for a negotiated framework, while publicly maintaining their support for Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. The goal is to avoid the appearance of pressuring Ukraine while simultaneously making it clear to all parties that the current trajectory is not sustainable indefinitely. This is a diplomatically delicate maneuver, and it requires a level of message discipline and coordination that is genuinely difficult to maintain, especially in an era of maximum information transparency, where leaks are constant and public pressure is intense. What I think is really happening is that Washington has concluded that the window for a negotiated framework is not years away. It is much closer than the public discourse suggests. The combination of Russian economic stress, Ukrainian battlefield fatigue, European political pressure from populations dealing with the economic consequences of prolonged conflict, and an American political environment that is increasingly complicated on questions of foreign spending, all of these factors are converging in a way that creates both a need and an opportunity for a more active diplomatic process. The United States, in my reading, has decided to begin quietly engineering that process rather than waiting for the battlefield to create the conditions on its own. What does this mean for Ukraine specifically? Here is where I think the analysis gets genuinely surprising. Most people expected that if Washington shifted its posture, it would do so in a way that would feel like abandonment to Kyiv. And there are certainly voices in Ukraine and in the diaspora who read any shift in American posture through exactly that lens. But in my analysis, what Washington is actually attempting to do is something more sophisticated. It is trying to bring Ukraine along on a process that Ukraine has, until recently, strongly resisted, which is a genuine conversation about what a negotiated framework might look like, without framing that conversation in terms of territorial concession or defeat. This is extraordinarily difficult politically, both for the Ukrainian government and for Washington. And it is made more difficult by the fact that it has to be done largely out of the public eye, because any public acknowledgement of these conversations creates enormous political pressure from all directions. Now, what about Russia in all of this? Here is something that most people are missing in their reading of Moscow's behavior. Russia has been signaling, through various channels including back-channel diplomatic communications and public statements that contain deliberate ambiguities, that it is not entirely opposed to a framework that would allow it to exit this conflict with something it can present domestically as a success. The question is what that something looks like. In my analysis, Moscow's actual requirements for a settlement are narrower than its public maximalist position suggests, but they are still very difficult for Ukraine and the West to accept without significant political cost. The gap between what Russia needs to say yes and what Ukraine can accept without political collapse is real, but it is not necessarily unbridgeable. And the United States, in my reading, has concluded that the gap is narrow enough that active engineering of a framework is now worth the diplomatic and political risk. Here is what I think is really happening at the deepest structural level. The United States has decided that the cost of indefinite conflict in Ukraine, measured not just in dollars and weapons but in strategic distraction, alliance cohesion, economic disruption, and geopolitical precedent, now exceeds the cost of actively working toward an endpoint that is a profound strategic shift. It does not mean Washington is abandoning Ukraine. It means Washington has decided that active diplomatic engineering, done correctly, gives Ukraine a better outcome than continued open-ended conflict. Whether that judgment is correct is something historians will debate for a long time. But in my analysis, it is the judgment that is driving American behavior right now. What does this mean for Russia's actual war capacity? Based on publicly available reports from economists and defense analysts who track these things, Russia's ability to sustain its current operational tempo is facing real and growing constraints. The sanctions enforcement intensification I mentioned earlier is part of this, but there are other factors as well. Russia's labor market is under enormous strain from military mobilization. Its production capacity for certain critical munitions categories is being stretched. Its diplomatic isolation, while never complete, has become more meaningful in certain specific domains. None of this means Russia is on the verge of collapse. I want to be very clear about that, because I think that kind of wishful thinking has led to some badly wrong predictions over the past few years. But it does mean that Russia's leaders are doing their own strategic calculus about the sustainability of the current trajectory, and that calculus, in my reading, is part of what makes a negotiated framework possible in a way it was not 12 or 18 months ago. Let me turn to the implications, because I think this is where the analysis becomes most practically useful for anyone trying to understand what is going to happen in the coming months. If my analysis is correct, here is what to watch for in the next 30–60 days. The first thing is the diplomatic traffic between Washington and European capitals. Specifically, watch for any signs of convergence between the American position and the positions of France and Germany, which have historically been more open to a negotiated framework than some of the Eastern European NATO members. If you start to see language from Paris and Berlin that begins to align more closely with American signaling, that tells you something important about how far along the back-channel process actually is. The second thing to watch is Ukrainian domestic politics. President Zelensky's position on negotiations has evolved over time, and it is more nuanced than his public statements sometimes suggest. Watch for any signals from Kyiv that indicate a quiet shift in the internal conversation about what terms might be acceptable under what conditions. These signals will be subtle. They will not come in the form of press conferences, but they will be there if you know what to look for, in the language used in interviews, in the positioning of specific officials, in the diplomatic visits that are announced and the ones that are not. The third thing to watch is the economic data coming out of Russia. Specifically, watch the ruble's performance, the oil price dynamics, and any reporting on Russian industrial output in defense-related sectors. If the sanctions enforcement intensification is having the effect that Washington believes it is having, you should start to see evidence of that in the economic data over the next 1 to 2 quarters. That data will tell you whether the economic pressure component of Washington's strategy is working as intended. Those are the 3 things I would watch most closely. They will not tell you everything. Geopolitics never gives you clean signals, but in my analysis, they are the most reliable indicators of whether the strategic shift I have described is actually producing the outcomes Washington is engineering for. There is one more thing I want to say before I wrap up this analysis, and it is perhaps the most important thing of all. Whatever you think about the rights and wrongs of this conflict, whatever your political perspective, whatever your national background, the situation we are in right now is one of extraordinary historical consequence. The decisions being made in Washington, in Kyiv, in Moscow, in Brussels, in Beijing, and in other capitals right now will shape the global security environment for a generation. And those decisions are being made by human beings under conditions of enormous uncertainty and pressure, with imperfect information and competing interests. That means they will not always be right. It means the situation will continue to evolve in ways that surprise everyone, and it means that careful, honest, humble analysis, the kind that acknowledges uncertainty and resists the temptation of false certainty, is more valuable than ever. In my analysis, the United States has made a genuinely significant strategic move. It has decided to stop waiting for this conflict to resolve itself and to begin actively engineering the conditions for an endpoint. Whether that endpoint serves Ukraine's interests, whether it upholds the principles of international law and sovereignty, whether it creates a precedent that makes the world more or less stable, those are questions that will be answered over months and years, not days. But the decision to make that move, in my reading, has already been made. And that is why I think this moment is more consequential than most of the coverage of it suggests. If this analysis is correct, the next 60 days will begin to make that clearer. Watch the diplomatic signaling. Watch the Ukrainian domestic conversation. Watch the economic data. And most importantly, keep questioning. Keep looking at multiple sources. Keep holding your conclusions loosely enough that you can update them. When new information comes in, that is what good analysis looks like, and that is what I am always trying to offer you here. This is independent analysis only. I am not a news organization. I am not an official source of any kind. I could be wrong about any or all of this. What I have offered you today is my honest, careful, calm reading of a genuinely complex situation, based on publicly available information and the analytical frameworks I have developed. Over many years of studying how great powers behave, take it for what it is. Think critically about it. Push back if you disagree. I genuinely want to hear your perspective. Drop it in the comments below. If you found this useful, subscribe, because I post every single day and every video is an attempt to give you something more than the noise. I want to give you the signal. All information in this video is based on publicly available reports and represents personal opinion and independent analysis only. Nothing here constitutes news reporting or should be taken as fact without independent verification. The views expressed are solely those of the analyst and do not represent any organization, government, or institution.